Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating story. We're looking at how Yvon Chouinard built Patagonia into a massive global powerhouse by doing something completely counterintuitive, consistently making decisions that, at least on paper, looked like absolutely terrible short-term business moves. All right, let's jump right in. Picture this. It's Ventura, California, early 1970s. Yvon Chouinard, who was actually a blacksmith before he became a businessman, is looking at the sales numbers for the product that literally built his company, steel pitons. You know those metal spikes climbers hammer straight into rock faces to secure their ropes? Well, he makes the best ones in the world. But there's a huge, glaring problem. What happens when your best-selling product is actively destroying the very thing you love? Chouinard realizes his world-class pitons are actually widening and crumbling the pristine cracks on the walls of Yosemite. His own success was causing harm he'd never even reckoned with. So that brings us to Section 1, the piton problem, and a serious founder's dilemma. To fix this, he made a totally radical pivot to what they started calling clean climbing. Instead of his cash cow, those steel pitons that had to be brutally hammered in and scarred the rock, he and his partner totally retooled around aluminum chocks. Now, these are wedged into cracks just by hand, they come out without a hammer, and they leave the rock totally untouched. Think about that for a second. Chouinard voluntarily walked away from his primary source of revenue. And honestly, the craziest part? They actively used their own product catalog to tell their loyal customers, hey, we've actually been doing this wrong. And you know what happened? It's kind of amazing. Customers actually responded by buying the new chocks. It was a massive risk, but it completely paid off. The company survived its own integrity, and in doing so, they discovered almost by accident that integrity is a brand no competitor can copy. It really proves that recognizing the harm in your own success and actually doing something about it takes serious guts, but it builds unparalleled trust. Moving right along to Section 2, the accidental clothing company and how they started funding the gear. The origin story here is just fantastic. Chouinard started out forging pitons and literally selling gear from the trunk of his car, really just to fund his own life of climbing and surfing. But on a trip to Scotland in 1970, he bought some tough, super colorful rugby shirts, the kind built to survive a heavy scrum, and he started wearing them on his rock climbs. While his friends wanted them, he imports a few more, and boom, they sell out instantly. Suddenly, a light bulb goes off. Selling clothing could actually be the engine that funds the gear business. And that single thread eventually spun into its own massive clothing brand. In 1973, Patagonia was officially born, named after that wild, heavily storied region way down at the end of South America. But here's the key. That early lesson from the whole piton problem, it didn't just vanish. It actually became the operating system for everything that followed, as this accidental clothing company grew into one of the most respected outdoor brands on the planet.
Which leads us to Section 3, structuring the mission and how they scaled this ethos.
So how exactly do you scale that level of integrity? Well, you do it through structural commitments. Instead of relying on flashy, superficial marketing campaigns, these are hard, non-negotiable pledges written directly into how a company sources, spends, and operates. Patagonia's whole strategy was basically just letting their mission attract people who already shared it, embedding their core values right into the foundation of the business. That underlying structure is exactly why their customers believe them so fiercely. You can literally track the drumbeat of these commitments over the decades. Following that initial 1973 clean climbing pivot, they eventually took a hard look at what conventional cotton farming does to the earth. So, in 1996, they switched to 100% organic cotton. It was way costlier, much harder to source, but to them, completely non-negotiable. Then, fast forward to 2002, they instituted what they called an earth tax by co-founding 1% for the planet. This pledged 1% of total sales, and I mean gross sales, not just profits, to environmental causes. That money goes straight out the door, period, regardless of whether the business had a good year or a bad year. Now for the biggest move of all. Section 4, Earth as only shareholder. The final commitment. $3 billion. At 83 years old, rather than selling the company or taking it public, which, let's be real, either of those options would have made his family billionaires many times over, Yvon Chouinard simply walked away from a valuation of $3 billion. Instead of taking the cash, he and his family transferred their entire ownership stake into a brand new trust structure built for one single purpose. Going forward, roughly $100 million in Patagonia profits will be directed every single year to fight for the planet. That's a staggering amount of money, year after year. As Chouinard bluntly put it at the time, Earth is now the company's only shareholder. This quote just perfectly captures the final, most permanent expression of their mission. They literally took the deepest layer of any company, its actual ownership structure, and changed it entirely to reflect its ultimate purpose. Now, of course, a move this unprecedented wasn't met with uniform reactions across the board, and we should look at this impartially. On one hand, the sheer scale of giving a $3 billion company to its own purpose has been incredibly widely praised. But on the other hand, the structure has also drawn some scrutiny. Critics point out that there were significant tax advantages gained by the family, as well as the fact that they do retain voting control. But, even the deepest skeptics can see the undeniable rarity of a founder actively choosing to give his company away to a cause like this. So let's wrap this all up in Section 5, the business of integrity, and look at the universal lessons here. What does all this actually mean for you, whether you're out there building a brand or just navigating your own career? Well, first, living your values structurally builds a kind of trust that is completely uncopyable. Second, action matters far, far more than your messaging. Third, accepting short-term costs can yield massive long-term gains. And perhaps most powerfully, what you intentionally choose not to sell or do can define your reputation just as much as anything you actually do. Remember, absolutely none of Patagonia's decades-long growth happens if Chouinard had just treated his values as some side hobby, totally separate from his profit-driven business. The lesson stitched into every single Patagonia jacket is that the biggest leaps usually start with a small, kind of shaky first step. So I'm going to leave you with this question to think about. Are you willing to separate what you build from what you believe, or will you act on your convictions long before it's fashionable, even when it costs you? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.